Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you some of my experiences playing against my opponent's weaknesses. And sometimes one wants to trade one type of weakness for a different kind. You'll find out very soon what I mean. This position is from a game of mine that I played in the Hungarian Championship back in 1991. It's clear that I have a target, namely in the weak d5 pawn. Why is that pawn weak compared to all the others? It is because it's isolated, which means that it does not have another pawn of the same color next to it on either side. In itself, that wouldn't be such a major problem, but in addition to that, the fact that it's on a file where white can attack it makes it a real problem. Like here, the white rook already being on d4, blocking the pawn's further advancement and pressuring it, attacking it, and white has the opportunity to double up with the second rook coming to the d file, and then eventually triple up with the queen coming also to that very same file, all attacking that poor little pawn. And in addition, the bishop is also helping out. Many times in such situations, the ultimate problem ends to be that white is able to use the pin, such as moving here the pawn from e2 to e4, using the fact that the black pawn now obviously cannot capture the white pawn without losing the queen, and white has attacked the pawn now a third time. But here, black can save himself by tactical means, by creating a counter pin. It's very important to stress that while strategy is certainly important, tactics always take precedence over strategy. So in this case, after white would try to win the pawn, black could safely recapture without losing a bishop, as after bishop takes, the rook can take because the queen on b2 is in the pin. Okay, let's go back to the starting position and see how I continued. Instead of being in a rush winning the pawn, I simply doubled my rooks on the d file by rook f to d1. My opponent responded the same way by moving his queen to f6. Again, because of the pin, the pawn is safe at the moment on d5. Typically, whenever your opponent creates a pin over one of your pieces, the first thing should be on your mind how to get out of that pin. And that's exactly what I did in this case by moving my queen away from the pin and moreover putting it on a square where it targets black's weakness. Right now, white has 4 pieces pressuring black's weakness on d5. At the moment, black is protecting it only twice. Therefore, even if black would protect the pawn a third time, for example by bringing the rook to d8, it would still not be sufficient and the pawn could be either captured right away or, in fact, in that case, e4 may be a very good choice as well, using the pin. Black smartly, realizing the situation, looked for counterplay and played rook f to c8 with the idea that when I will capture the pawn, which by the way I did, the black rook will come to c2, making a fork by attacking my queen as well as the pawn on a2. In situations as such, when you see that your opponent has a back rank problem, the first thing to look for is see if there is a way to take advantage of it. But in this case, after a quick search, we can resign to the idea to use that trick because black is sufficiently defended on that territory. The d8 square is guarded by the rook and the queen, and there is no immediate tactic that white could pull off. So I had to simply move my queen away from the attack and allow my opponent to win the pawn back by rook takes pawn. Now the material has balanced again, and unless I create new and immediate threats, the game will be rather drawish. The next move is quite important to create a new weakness, a new target in black's position. Therefore, I traded bishops. And again, as so often in chess, tactics take over the situation. And here black must weaken himself by recapturing with a pawn, because here already, if the queen would recapture, black indeed would suffer with a back rank problem. So therefore, black recaptured with a pawn in this position. And now black has a new weakness, a new isolated pawn on e6. However, this weakness isn't as bad as the previous one was, because it's not quite on an open file, as I still have a pawn on e2. However, black has another problem, namely that white has a total control of the d file and the possibility to enter the 7th rank with his rook. At the moment, I played rook e4, focusing to attack the pawn on e6, while still maintaining the control of the d file. Now, the immediate threat is to move my queen up to d7 to attack the rook and my opponent's pawn on e6. Therefore, he moved his rook to e8, preparing against that, but nevertheless, my queen appeared on d7 attacking black's rook. Rook e7 right now would be a poor choice because black would lose his queen right away after queen c8, and now either the king moves out of the check when I can pin with rook to f4, or if black instead blocks the check, the pin arrives with rook d8, and in either case, white wins black's queen. Let's go back. After queen d7, my opponent played queen to e7 instead, hoping that I would trade queens, and then indeed black's troubles would be solved, as after, for example, the trade and the intent to chase the black king, with all reality the checks run out sooner or later, and the endgame is quite reasonable for black with equal number of pawns on the board. Generally, in situations with even material, when one side has the initiative, it's not a good idea to trade queens or pieces in general, unless that trade brings an immediate gain of material. Move my queen back to c6, a very important move, maintaining the queens on the board and preparing the entrance to the 7th rank with rook to d7. And here my opponent made the final mistake of the game by not preparing for my threat of rook d7. Best was to avoid immediate loss to play queen f7, and then after rook d7, queen g6, when black still would be in the fight. Instead, my opponent played rook to a5, after which black already cannot avoid losing material. Now, if the black queen is trying to hang on to the pawn on e6, the problem is the rook on e8 is unprotected, and white will be able to make a discovery by rook takes g7 and then capturing black's rook. My opponent chose to give up the other pawn and went back to f8, and then I simply grabbed the pawn, and black is in serious trouble. Was trying to hang in to the rook, queen b7, rook c1 check, but it's only one check, rook f5, threatening to capture on f2, simply f3, and black played rook f7, and after rook f7 resigned because the black queen will be lost after takes, check, and pinning the queen. Quite a straightforward game and a good example on how to play against the isolated pawn, and then when a trade may happen, how to create new weaknesses and not to worry about when a weakness appears, as long as another weakness or another target in the opponent's position appears. Here what we saw is first the fight against the d5 isolated pawn, then there was a combination of a weak e6 pawn and the control of the d file along with the entrance to the 7th rank, and towards the end black suffered also from the fact that the black king was on a back rank and all kind of pins were coming because the queen was also misplaced. Now let's see a second example on the theme of the isolated pawn. Here we go. This is a game between Grandmasters Salov and Mikhail Gurevich. In this position, it was white's turn, and similarly to the previous example, black has a weak isolated pawn on d5. But at the moment, it's sufficiently protected by black's bishop as well as knight on f6. White immediately retreated the knight to d3, offering the exchange of the queens. Black certainly could have accepted this offer and trade queens on f4, but white would have had a rather pleasant endgame playing to attack that pawn, with black only able to hope to save the game after a lot of suffering and defending. Black instead, at the moment, played rook e8, counterattacking on e2. But this is not a big danger for white. White just played e3. And here black's best choice was to trade queens with queen f4 and then simply protect the pawn with rook a to d8. Of course, white is still having a rather pleasant position here anyway. Black instead, in the game, continued by playing a5. And now white simply improved his position by playing rook a to c1. As you can see, white is simply nicely improving his position by centralizing the pieces, putting the rook on an open file with the idea to enter to the 7th rank through c7. Indeed, black's next move is trying to prevent just that by playing rook e7. Now came queen to d4, attacking another target, the pawn on b6. And black responded by protecting the pawn. And finally, knight arrived to f4. So at the moment, white has 4 pieces attacking the pawn between the queen, rook, knight, and bishop. And black brought another piece to protect, the rook from a8 to d8. Let's see for a moment what would happen if the other rook would come to the rescue and protect the pawn. Well, in that case, white planned to play e4 and use the pin. This is a very common theme, a very common idea when you're when you're playing against an isolated pawn. That the opponent is trying to defend it, but at the end of the day ends up being in a pin, just like here. Another attempt after knight f4 would be to play queen a3. But in that case, white would simply capture the pawn, because now the problem is that the rook is hanging and black doesn't get the time to capture the pawn on a2. For example, knight takes, bishop takes, and if now queen a2, black suffers from the back rank checkmate. After takes, queen d8. Let's go back again. As I mentioned, black played here rook to d8. And now, despite the fact that it seems that black is protecting the pawn enough times, in reality they are not. And that's because of the back rank problem. So white can just take anyway. Bishop took, bishop took. If now black would take, white would just take back, because after queen takes, rook takes, black could not capture the white rook because of rook c8. In this position, black played instead rook e to d7, trying to use the pin. But again, even though black seems to be using the pin, they are not winning the pawn back because of the same back rank problem. Takes, and now the pawn is taboo. Black needed to waste a move by playing king f8. And now white is targeting a new pawn, the one on b6. If black would advance, white would just run after the pawn. Black captured the pawn, white captured the pawn, and white is a pawn ahead finally, and eventually won the game. And now let's see the duel of the week. Here we go. Look at this position. Each side has 2 rooks and a couple of pawns. In fact, black is a pawn up. Before I say anything more, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out what should white do in this position. Then come back and listen to what I have to say the correct solution is. Typically, in an endgame, when one side is a pawn down without an obvious pass pawn about to get promoted or an immediate tactic that would gain material, we normally are happy to agree to a draw and save a position with less material on the board. Like, for example, a typical way to end the game would be to try to trade off the pieces and win back the pawn and capture the pawn on f6 and settle for a draw. In this case, that would be throwing away half a point. White, in fact, is able to win this game. The reason why that is because the black king is in a rather unfortunate position, and white, in fact, has a very active position with the potential of a passed pawn on d6, even though it cannot advance right away because it would be captured by black's rook. but combining that threat with an immediate mating attack on the black king, in fact, can lead to success. And the correct answer is immediately king c6. This immediately creates a mating attack by swinging the rooks over to the queen side, as well as combining the threat of advancing the d-pawn. If right now black would respond by playing rook h1, white would immediately check, when black clearly cannot move to the a file because of an immediate checkmate with rook a3, and after king c8, white would just play rook a5, threatening with checkmate in the corner. The black king reaches no escape going to d8 because white's d6 pawn controls the e7 square, and moving back to b8 is no help because of a two-move checkmate. While trying to block the check by playing rook b1 right now, instead of king b8, playing rook b1 doesn't solve black's problems either, because after check, rook blocks, white now comes from the other side by playing rook e3, threatening checkmate on e8. And then after rook g8, d7 again achieves checkmate in just a couple of moves. But let's see a different defense for black. For example, pawn takes pawn. Well, now white responds quite similarly with rook b5 check. If now the black king goes to c8, white basically checkmates in just a couple of moves simply by making a discover check with king d6 and then rook b8 checkmate. But what happens if the black king moves to the corner? And after rook check, the rook blocks. Now, a very nice move, king b6, opening up the c file, and then if rook takes rook, rook c8 checkmate. Quite elegant. I hope you enjoyed it, and of course learned some ideas on how to play against the isolated pawn. As you could see in both examples, in addition to the weakness, the isolated pawn, the weakness of the back rank also played an important role. Very often in chess, it is not enough to have one weakness in the opponent's position for us to win the game. There may be need for an additional target or weakness. Thank you for listening. So long until next week.